Coldwater Ridge, Montana Territory, October 1887. The air that morning carried the particular cruelty of a season not yet committed to its worst. It was cold enough to remind you it was coming, but not cold enough to prepare you for what that truly meant. The kind of cold that didn't bite, it whispered. Patient. Certain. The way a creditor waits outside a door he knows will eventually open. Inside the town hall, a single room smelling of pine resin and old ambition, the last act of a small drama was being performed. Not with ceremony, not with the weight that such moments deserved, but with something far more devastating than either the quiet carpeted efficiency of men who had already decided and were now simply announcing. Ara Voss stood beside her mother and held herself absolutely still. She was 17 years old, and she had learned early that stillness was its own kind of armor. Not the stillness of surrender, the stillness of a person who understands that the room is watching for weakness and has decided not to provide it. Her hands were at her sides. Her chin was level. Her dark eyes moved across the 5 men seated at the long table, the way her father had taught her to read a rock face, not looking at the surface, but at what the surface was telling you about everything underneath. What the surface was telling her now was not good. Helena Voss stood beside her daughter wrapped in a shawl that had been washed too many times and pressed too carefully that morning, which was the saddest kind of careful, the kind that knows it won't be enough, but does it anyway. Helena was a woman who had come to Montana from a village outside Stuttgart 18 years ago, with a husband, a leather trunk, and a stubbornness that 2 decades of frontier hardship had compressed into something almost geological. Her English still carried the rounded weight of her first language vowels that arrived slightly late to their consonants, which made shopkeepers repeat themselves and strangers speak to her slowly. She had spent 18 years pretending not to notice. Conrad Voss had been the buffer between his wife and a world that was not built for her. A German-born miner with hands like quarried stone and a mind that worked the way deep geology works, slowly, precisely, and in ways the surface could not predict. He had read rock the way other men read weather finding and pressure lines and thermal gradients, a language that the earth had been speaking for millennia before the first human ear opened to hear it. Coldwater Ridge's copper mine had employed him for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had earned the kind of respect that frontier towns grant reluctantly to men. They don't entirely understand the respective results. He found ore where other men found only expense. He predicted cave-ins before the timber groaned. He understood the mountain. Then the mountain took him, a collapsed shaft 14 months ago, the kind of accident that the mine company called an act of God, and the miners called what happens when you cut corners on the timbering. Conrad Voss went into the earth on a Tuesday morning and did not come back up, and the world he left behind was smaller for it in every measurable way. Judge Aldous Crane cleared his throat. He was a large man, soft through the middle in the way that prosperity makes men soft, with a watch chain that caught the lamplight each time he shifted in his chair. He had the face of a man who had decided long ago that his comfort and the community's good were essentially the same thing, and had spent 30 years finding evidence to support this conclusion. The board has reviewed your situation, Mrs. Voss. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he has practiced delivering. With the coming winter and your current circumstances, we cannot continue to hold the cabin on charter land. It is needed for the new assayer. Helena's hands tightened around her shawl. The sound in her chest, the dry, rattling percussion that had been her constant companion since September, threatened to break through. She suppressed it with the discipline of a woman who has learned that coughing in public is another form of weakness she cannot afford to display. Ilara's eyes moved past Crane to the back row of benches. A young man sat there who did not belong to any board, who held no official position in this room, who had no stated reason to be present at a proceeding concerning the housing of a widow and her daughter. He was perhaps 20 years old, with the clean hands and new coat of someone who expected to inherit things. He was watching Judge Crane with the quiet attention of a person who already knows how a conversation ends. When Crane mentioned the cabin, the young man Foster Crane, the judge's nephew, though no one in this room would say that name aloud, gave the smallest possible nod of satisfaction. The cabin wasn't needed. It was wanted. And there was a difference between those two words wide enough to break a life across. "We are not without charity," Crane continued, and the men beside him arranged their faces into expressions of solemn generosity. He gestured toward a map pinned to the wall. "The board has deeded you a plot, 3 acres at the northern edge of the territory line. It is yours free and clear. Elara looked at the map. She knew the plot. Everyone in Coldwater Ridge knew the plot. They called it the Scarp, a steep north-facing slope of loose shale and wind-twisted juniper, worthless for timber, worthless for grazing with no water source, save the snowmelt that ran off it each spring in angry channel-cutting torrents before disappearing into the thirsty ground. Its only distinguishing feature was a shallow opening in the hillside near its upper edge, a dark fissure in the ancient rock that local children called Bear's Mouth, though no bear had ever been desperate enough to consider it shelter. It was not a gift. It was an eviction notice written on a deed, a death sentence dressed in the language of charity. They were being removed from the picture that Coldwater Ridge was building of itself, a prosperous picture, clean and forward-looking, and given a place to disappear where their disappearance would not trouble anyone's conscience. Elara stepped forward. The movement was small, barely perceptible, but it shifted the weight of the room. She took the deed from Crane's outstretched hand. Her calloused fingers did not tremble. She looked at the map, not at his face. "We thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. It cut through the room's solemn theater and landed without ceremony. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and Helena walked with her, and the only sound was the creak of floorboards under their boots. She almost missed it. She was nearly at the door, her hand was on the frame. The gray October light was waiting for her on the other side, when a sound reached her that was barely a sound at all, more like a vibration. 5 words muttered from the direction of the long bench in the room's far corner, pitched precisely low enough that only someone within 3 feet would catch them. "Your father surveyed that hill." Elara stopped. She turned. In the corner on the long bench where he had apparently been sitting throughout the entire proceeding was a man she recognized as a fixture of this town, the way a fence post is a fixture, present unremarkable, looked past without being seen. Ezra Holt, 65 years old, retired from the mines after his knees gave out living in a cabin at the edge of town, appearing at meetings the way weather appears reliably without invitation and without anyone particularly caring. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low. His eyes were closed or appeared to be. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of a man in the shallow end of a nap. By the time Elara blinked, he was standing shuffling toward the back door at the far end of the room, his silhouette appearing for a single moment against the gray rectangle of light before he was simply gone. She stood at the door frame with the deed in one hand and a question in the other. "Your father surveyed that hill." Outside, the cold received them without sympathy. Nathan Hollis was waiting. He stood against the porch post of his father's general store across the road, arms folded, watching the town hall door with the studied casualness of a young man who wanted to appear as though he hadn't been watching it at all. He was 19 tall through the body, with a face that hadn't quite settled into what it was going to be, the bones still negotiating their final arrangement. Cruelty would have been simpler. What drove Nathan Hollis was harder to name and harder to cure the hunger of a person who has confused being needed with being loved and has spent 10 years unable to tell the difference. His mother had died when he was 9, lung sickness, the same wet rattle that now lived in Helena's chest, the same progression, the same geography of deterioration. His father, the elder Hollis, had never spoken of her again. He had taught his son one lesson through the silence in this town: you are either useful or you are invisible. Nathan had spent 10 years trying to be useful. He pushed off from the post as Elara and Helena walked past, falling into step beside them with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this. "I heard about the council's decision," he said. "Listen, my father has a room behind the store. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You could work the counter a few hours a day to cover the cost." He said it with an easy smile that did not quite reach the watchful place behind his eyes. Elara stopped walking. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but without the softness he was waiting for. Then she looked at Nathan the way she had looked at the map on Crane's wall, reading the surface for what it was telling her about what lay beneath. What lay beneath was a 19-year-old boy who did not want to give them a room. He wanted to give them an obligation. He wanted to be necessary. And necessity, once established, has a way of becoming permanent. She saw something else, too, the way his eyes had moved to Helena when he spoke, the way they stalled there for just a beat too long. Helena coughed, then a brief, suppressed sound, and something shifted in Nathan's face. A shadow passing through. Something old and not entirely his to explain. "No," Elara said. "Just that. No explanation, No softening, no apology for the abruptness. She said it the way you close a door, not angrily, but completely. Nathan's smile held its shape, but the thing behind his eyes changed temperature. "Pride doesn't keep you warm," he said to her back. She did not turn around. Helena's hand found her daughter's arm and held it, and they walked together up the road that climbed out of the town's shallow valley toward the lodgepole pines and the town of Coldwater Ridge with its new lumber mill and its bright painted storefronts and its careful picture of itself fell away behind them. She was 14 again. Memory does not announce itself. It simply arrives pulled by some internal gravity of loss. And Alara was walking a mountain road in October, but also descending a mine shaft in July 3 years ago, following her father down the timbered throat of the earth. The shaft had gone at a steep angle braced with lodgepole beams that groaned under the mountain's patient weight. The air grew warmer as they descended, which had unsettled her the first time she had expected the deep earth to be cold. It was the opposite. At 200 feet, Conrad stopped. He turned off his lamp. The darkness was total. Not the darkness of a room with the curtains drawn or a road without a moon. This was the darkness that existed before the first human eye opened a living pressing thing that found the edges of her and did not stop there. "Don't be afraid," her father said, and his voice in that darkness had the particular quality of something entirely real, stripped of performance, stripped of the small adjustments people make when they know they're being seen. Just the man himself and his certainty. "Listen," he said. She listened. Not with her ears because there was nothing to hear. She listened with her skin. And slowly, not quickly, the earth does not work quickly, she felt it. Warmth, coming from the rock walls themselves, radiating outward with the slow generosity of something that had been storing it for a very long time. Conrad lit the lamp again. His eyes were bright in the way they got when the world had just confirmed something he'd suspected. "Down here," he said, "the temperature barely changes. Summer, winter, it doesn't matter. The surface is a liar, Alara. It screams with the heat and the cold. But down here, the earth tells the same story all year. A story of constancy." He paused, his hand on the rock wall, his expression turning inward. "That piece of land north of town," he said. "The one with the fissure in the rock, the Scarp, they call it." His voice had gone quieter, more careful. The voice he used when he was thinking about something he wasn't quite ready to share. "Everyone says it's worthless." He smiled, a small private thing. "But I see something they can't." A shout from deeper in the mine, a timber brace that needed resetting. Conrad turned toward the sound, already moving, and the conversation ended the way a candle ends, abruptly, completely, without the possibility of continuation. They never finished it. 3 months later, the shaft collapsed. Now walking beside her mother on this cold October road, Alara understood that the unfinished sentence had just been handed to her, wrapped in a deed delivered by the very men who meant it as a punishment. The following morning, she went alone to see Doc Taft. His office was attached to the back of his house, a single room of carbolic acid and old paper, where the shelves held things that required more confidence than hope to be useful in this territory. Taft himself was 60 years old, lean and precise, with spectacles that sat at the absolute end of his nose, as though they were perpetually reconsidering their commitment to his face. He was not a warm man. He was an honest one, which in a frontier town was worth considerably more. He had examined Helena the previous week. He spoke to Alara on the porch, his voice low and without decoration. "Your mother's lungs are badly compromised. The tissue is scarred. If she spends the winter in cold, damp conditions or in a space filled with smoke, she will not see February." He removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I am not speculating. I am telling you a medical fact. What does she need? Warm air, dry air, clean air, consistently." He emphasized the word as though it were doing the work of several sentences. "Not warm for 1 hour and cold for the next 3. Consistently." He put his spectacles back on and turned toward his door. Then he stopped. "Your father came to see me once, perhaps 2 years before the accident. He wanted to know about mine air, specifically whether a person could live underground without respiratory damage over an extended period. He was asking about ventilation, air exchange rates, humidity control." Taft was quiet for a moment, as though deciding something. "He had theories, very specific theories. I believe he found his answers." The door closed. Alara stood on the porch in the cold morning air, with the particular quality of stillness that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of too much of it arriving at once. Her father had not simply been a miner who kept interesting notes. He had been designing something. The Scarp was not a worthless piece of land given to two women to die on. It was an inheritance she was only now receiving years late, delivered by men who had no idea what they were handing her. She went to the land that same afternoon, alone on foot, taking the path that wound upward through the last stands of timber and emerged onto the open slope. It was as hostile as she remembered. The ground was carpeted in loose shale that shifted and slid underfoot. The wind had a constant presence up here, not a passing thing, but a condition like gravity. The juniper trees were stunted and twisted, shaped by decades of arguing with weather they could not win against. And there was the cave, Bear's Mouth. The children's name was unkind but not inaccurate. It was a dark slit in a wall of ancient rock, perhaps 10 feet wide and 7 feet high at its tallest point. Thorny brambles clawed at the entrance. She pushed through them and stepped inside. The air changed immediately. Still, cool and damp and smelling of wet stone and deep time, the smell of things that have been undisturbed for a very long while. The light from the entrance fell away quickly, revealing a space that went back perhaps 30 feet, before narrowing into a crack too small to follow. She stood at the mouth of the cave and simply breathed. Then she did something her father had taught her to do in the mine when you wanted to understand a space before you judged it. She wet her finger and held it up. The faintest current of air moved across her skin, moving from the cave's interior toward the entrance. A slow exhalation, barely perceptible, driven by some temperature differential between the still air deep inside and the cooling air beyond. The cave was breathing. She was turning to leave, cataloging, not yet deciding when she saw it. On a flat rock, perhaps 6 feet from the cave entrance, arranged with a neatness that did not belong to the elements, a pickaxe, a short-handled shovel, an iron chisel. Old tools, well-used handles worn smooth in the specific places that years of work wear them smooth. But sharpened recently, the edges caught the last of the afternoon light with a precision that fresh grinding makes. She crouched and looked at the handle of the pickaxe. She had grown up watching her father maintain his tools. The particular technique he used to sharpen the edge, a method passed through generations of men who had cut coal and copper from mountain bones, left a distinctive wear pattern on the bevel. A shallow angle ground in a specific sequence. She had watched it done 100 times. This was that pattern. Someone who had worked beside Conrad Voss. Someone who had stood close enough and long enough to learn the way he kept his tools. Beside the tools drawn on the surface of the flat rock in white chalk, as though it had been placed there precisely to be found, an arrow pointing into the cave, and next to the arrow, a number. 2 degrees. She stared at it for a long time. The number meant something specific, she was certain of it, but the picture was not complete yet. She filed it in the back of her mind the way her father had taught her to file information that didn't have a place yet, carefully without forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready to take. She picked up the pickaxe, felt its weight. For the first time since her father's death, she did not feel entirely alone on this hillside. That evening in the cabin they would lose at the end of the week, she spread Conrad's journal on the table and found the page she was looking for. He had written not of gold or silver, the things other men read the earth for, but of airflow, thermal mass heat conduction, the patient physics of stone. He was, she thought now, a poet of the invisible, a man who saw what moved through things rather than what things were made of. The diagram on the page showed a mine at it, a horizontal passage driven into a hillside rather than straight down. Beside it, in his neat, angular hand, the mountain breathes. In summer, the cool, dense air inside flows outward. In winter, the warmer, lighter air tries to rise, but a long, gentle slope can hold it. The stone is a miser. It holds every degree. A fire at the mouth is waste. A fire deep inside with a long passage beneath the floor teaches the smoke where its heat belongs. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the dark window where the October night pressed against the glass, and for a long time, she simply thought. A fire. A long passage. 40 feet of stone-lined flue running beneath the cave floor. The heat surrendered to the rock rather than expelled into the sky. The rock becoming a thermal battery, slow to charge, slow to discharge, radiating its stored warmth for hours after the fire itself had died to coals. Not a fireplace, not a stove, something older than both. The plan arrived in her mind with the completeness that good ideas always have, not as a series of steps, but as a whole thing already finished waiting for her to catch up to it. She told her mother that night. Helena listened without interrupting, which was not her habit. She sat in the chair beside the stove, her shawl pulled to her chin, the candle casting the long shadows that candlelight always casts in small rooms, making everything both more present and more fragile than it is in daylight. When Alara finished, the silence that followed was not the silence of consideration. It was the silence of a specific deep fear that has been sleeping for a while and just been woken up. "You are talking like your father," Helena said. Her voice was quiet. There was something beneath it, not anger, but the hairline fracture of a woman who has already buried one person she loved and is being asked to watch the other walk toward the same kind of edge. "And your father died underground." The words landed the way they were meant to. Alara felt them. She did not dismiss them. "This isn't a mine, Mama. It's a home. It is a hole in the ground." Helena's voice rose slightly, and the rising brought a cough, and the cough brought a long half-minute of helpless rattling effort that left her pale and gray and hollowed out. When she could speak again, her eyes were wet. "I would rather die among people than alone in a dark cave." "You won't die. I'll make sure of it. Your father made promises too." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass, and neither of them tried to handle them. They sat in silence for a while. The candle wavered. The wind pressed against the cabin walls with the patience of something that knows it will eventually get through. Finally, Helena said, "Show me the journal." Alara pushed it across the table. Helena looked at the diagrams, her eyes moving over her husband's handwriting, over the neat angular letters of a man she had shared a life with, over the drawings of passages and slopes, and the careful notations in the margins. She could not parse the technical language, but she recognized the handwriting. She recognized the particular way he formed his letters, the crossbar through the sevens, the way they did it in the village where he'd grown up. Something moved in her face. "Give me until the 15th of November, she said. "If the cave is not livable by then, truly livable, warm and dry and safe, we go back to the town and we accept whatever is offered, whatever they offer." She looked at her daughter. "Even the Hollis boy." Alara opened her mouth and closed it. She understood what this cost her mother to say. She understood that it was not a negotiation about engineering or physics or the thermal properties of sandstone. It was a negotiation about trust. Helena was asking her daughter to prove that the voice of the man they had both loved, the voice that had designed this, that had seen something in the Scarp that no one else could see, could still be trusted to keep them alive. "Mid-November," Alara said. They slept, or tried to. In the dark, with her mother's breathing close beside her, the cough coming and going like a tide, Alara stared at the ceiling and let the doubt in. Not because she wanted to, but because the dark has its own honesty, and she was too tired to argue with it. What if the rock was wrong? What if the cave had problems her father hadn't foreseen? What if the flue drew wrong, or the thermal mass wasn't sufficient, or the grade was off, and the whole 40 feet of labor produced nothing but a cold stone room with a smoke problem? What if she was wrong? She reached for the journal on the crate beside her bed and opened it in the dark, by feel her fingers moving over the pages until they found the one. She wanted a page near the back where the ink felt slightly different under her fingertips, slightly blurred as though something wet had once fallen on it. She could not read it. She would not light the candle. But she held the page. She felt the places where her father's pen had pressed through to the paper, the slight relief of each letter, each number, each carefully drawn line. She did not know yet what that page said. She could not read it in the dark. But she held it, and she felt the weight of his attention, the hours he had given to this, and she made herself believe, not because she had proof, but because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not available to her. The next morning they packed what they had into the handcart. It was the last day of September. 6 weeks remained until the 15th of November. Helena paused in the doorway of the cabin, just for a moment, just long enough to look back at the small room that had been theirs. Conrad's boots still sat beside the door. She had not been able to move them. She had tried twice. She could not make her hands do it. Alara did not look back. She was already calculating the angle of the first trench cut. When they passed the general store, Nathan Hollis was on the porch watching. He did not call out this time. He simply watched, arms crossed, his face arranged in an expression that he believed was sympathetic. But around the edges of it, in the set of his jaw, in the way his chin lifted slightly as they passed, There was the unmistakable quality of a man who fully expects to be proven right and has already begun to enjoy it. "When you can't take it anymore," he said just loud enough, "the store's always open." Helena's grip on her daughter's arm tightened. They kept walking. The road climbed. The lodgepole pines closed in on either side, then thinned, then gave way to the open slope of the Scarp, and the wind was waiting for them there, as it always was, as it always would be, patient and certain and utterly indifferent to what they intended. Elara set down the cart. She looked at the cave mouth, at the flat rock, with the chalk marking still visible, at the tools that had been left by a man whose name she had not yet confirmed, but whose loyalty to her father she could read in the care with which he had kept those edges sharp. She picked up the pickaxe. She felt the weight of it, the specific, well-distributed weight of a tool that had been used for a long time by someone who knew how to use it. The handle had been worn to the exact shape of the hands that had held it most. It fit hers differently, the way a path fits a different pair of feet, recognizably a path but not quite yours yet. She would make it hers. She carried it to the entrance of the cave, stepped inside and picked the spot, the first point of the line she had drawn in her mind, the beginning of the 40-foot passage that would run from this point to the chimney stack she would build at the far end of the slope. She measured the angle by eye, set her feet, raised the pickaxe. Helena, standing at the cave entrance with her shawl around her shoulders, began to hum. A German melody, something without a clear beginning or end, the kind of song that simply exists the way water exists, flowing and returning, neither starting nor finishing, just continuing. She hummed it while she unpacked the cart. She hummed it while she arranged their bedrolls against the cave wall. She hummed it while her daughter swung the pickaxe into the packed earth of the cave floor, and the impact rang up through the handle and into Alara's arms, and the sound of it filled the cave and bounced off the ancient stone and came back changed deeper, more resonant, as though the mountain itself had heard it and decided to listen. The first inch took 20 minutes. She had 5,279 more to go. The earth did not want to be moved. That was the first lesson, and Alara learned it not from a book or a warning, but from her own body, from her shoulders and her spine, and the skin of her palms, which by the third day had gone from raw to blistered to something tougher and more permanent, the kind of toughening that doesn't reverse itself. The floor of the cave was not soil. It was glacial till a dense ancient marriage of clay and shattered rock that had been compressed under the weight of ice for 10,000 years before the ice retreated and left it behind, hard as old argument, resistant as pride. Each swing of the pickaxe sent a shock up through the handle and into her wrists. Each shovelful of debris weighed more than it had any right to. She measured her progress not in feet, but in body lengths, 1 Alara length per day, when the ground was cooperative, half that, when she struck a seam of embedded granite that the pickaxe rang against without yielding. 12 hours, sometimes 14. On nights when the moon was bright enough to throw silver across the cave entrance, 16. Helena worked beside her when she could, which was less each day. She mixed the clay and water into a thick paste for sealing the flue stones, her arms trembling with the effort of stirring the heavy slurry. She gathered flat stones from the scree slope outside, testing each one by hand, pressing her thumb along the edge, feeling for the flatness that would allow 2 pieces to sit flush against each other. She rejected 3 stones for every one she kept. It was precise, invisible labor, the kind that leaves no monument but without which nothing stands. On the 5th morning, Judge Aldous Crane rode up to the Scarp on his bay gelding. He sat in the saddle and looked at the scene below him with the expression of a man encountering something he cannot categorize: the growing mound of excavated earth outside the cave mouth. The dark rectangular incision in the cave floor that was Alara's trench, now nearly 8 feet long, and Alara herself standing waist-deep in it, her hair streaked with grime, her arms moving with the mechanical rhythm of someone who has been doing this long enough that the movement has stopped being a decision. She did not pause when his shadow fell across her work. "What in God's name is this?" he said. Genuine bewilderment laced with the particular pity that comfortable men extend to those they have made uncomfortable. "Our hearth," Alara said. Crane stared at the trench. He looked at the cave. He looked back at the trench. "You're digging a ditch." "Yes." He shifted in the saddle leather, creaking. He told her what he had to tell her, that the land was hers free and clear, but that anything constituting a hazard, a fire risk, a structural danger, anything that might be deemed a threat to public safety, and the board retained the right to reclaim the property. He said it with the manner of a man discharging a duty. Then he waited, perhaps, hoping for an explanation or a plea or some acknowledgement that the situation was beyond her. When none came, he turned his horse and rode back toward town. The story he carried back spread through Coldwater Ridge, the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, low to the ground, consuming everything it touched. The widow Voss and her strange daughter were not simply building a shelter on the Scarp. They were digging some kind of underground channel 40 feet long, by all reports lining it with stones, sealing it with clay. The whispers gathered names. Voss's Folly, the Kraut Burrow. Some said the girl had gone mad with grief that she was trying to dig her way to the underworld to find her father. Some said it with amusement, some with contempt, some with the particular relief of people who find it easier to mock a strange thing than to understand it. Alara heard none of it. She was in the trench. On the seventh day, Ezra Holt came. He did not announce himself. He did not call out from the bottom of the slope or send any signal of his approach. He was simply there, suddenly sitting on a flat rock 20 feet from the cave entrance. His hat pulled low, his hands on his knees, watching the work with the unhurried attention of a man who has spent most of his adult life underground and has learned to observe without crowding. Alara came out of this trench for water. She saw him. She filled her cup from the jug, drank, and walked toward him. She stopped at a respectful distance, looked at him. He was older than she'd registered in the town hall. The lines of his face were deep and specific, the kind of lines that aren't made by time alone, but by weather and labor, and the particular compression of a life spent in hard places. His hands resting on his knees were a miner's hands. Knuckles, thick skin cross-hatched with old scars, nails permanently darkened at their edges, with the residue of work that soap doesn't fully reach. "You left the tool," she said. He didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either, not immediately. He looked at the trench for a while longer, then at the cave mouth, then at the growing arrangement of flat stones Helena had stacked along the slope. "Your father and I worked the same shaft for 11 years, he said. His voice had the quality of something that had been used infrequently and had grown slightly stiff in the joints. He was the best reader of rock I ever knew, better than men who'd been doing it twice as long. He didn't just see the geology, he understood it, the way it thought if stone can be said to think." Alara waited. "About a week before the accident, Ezra said he called me over to look at something in the East Passage, a formation he'd been watching for a while. He broke off a piece sandstone red with dark shale running through it in thin layers. He put it in my hand and said, 'Hold on to this. It's the future.'" Ezra's jaw moved slightly as though working around the memory. "I didn't understand what he meant. I've been carrying it since." She looked at his coat pocket, at the slight weight at the bottom of it. The small rectangular bulge of a stone carried long enough to have reshaped the fabric around it. "Why didn't you come to us sooner?" she asked. "After he died. Why wait until the deed was already signed?" Ezra was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I owed your father a debt I didn't know how to pay." He said it simply, without embellishment, and offered nothing more. It was an answer, and not an answer true as far as it went, but not all the way to the bottom of the thing. She could see that. She filed it the same way she'd filed the chalk mark, and the tools carefully, without forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready for. Ezra stood, picked up the short-handled shovel he had apparently brought with him, and walked toward the cave entrance. At the threshold, he paused. "The grade matters more than the depth," he said without turning around. "Your father knew that. Underground water follows its own logic." Then he stepped inside and began to work. He didn't ask where to start. He looked at the trench, understood its trajectory, positioned himself at the far end of the completed section, and began extending it. He worked slowly, his knees didn't allow him much else, but with a precision that more than compensated for pace. Each strike of his shovel was purposeful. He wasted nothing. They worked in silence for 3 hours. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have found the same frequency. That afternoon, Willa Callaway appeared at the creek below the slope. Alara had come down to fill the water jug. She was standing in the shallows jug, submerged, when she became aware of someone on the far bank. A woman standing very still, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth, wearing the expression of a deer that has wandered into a clearing and is not yet sure whether to stay or run. Willa Callaway was 35, with a round, open face that broadcast everything she felt, which was a disadvantage in a town that valued stoicism and an asset in a conversation where you needed to know if you were being told the truth. She held out the bundle without preamble. Wool yarn, a tin of lard, half a loaf it's from this morning. She spoke quickly, glancing over her shoulder toward the tree line. Merritt doesn't know I'm here. He'd be angry. Elara looked at the bundle. Her first instinct was refusal. She had spent the weeks since the town hall building a wall of self-reliance around herself and her mother, not out of pride exactly, but out of the understanding that in her current position, every obligation created was a vulnerability. Every favor accepted was a hand that might later expect to be shaken. But then she thought of Doc Taft's voice on his porch. Warm air, dry air, clean air, consistently. She thought of Helena's shawl threadbare at both elbows, worn to translucence at the shoulders. She thought of the cold that was coming, not the current cold, which was a suggestion, but the winter cold of Montana, which was a geological fact. She crossed the creek and took the bundle. Thank you, she said. Willa's face relaxed in a way that suggested she had been more nervous about this than she'd let on. I watch you from my kitchen window every day. Every morning before the light is full, you're already working. I've never seen anyone work like that, not even the men at the mine. Before she turned to leave, Willa's eyes moved past Elara to the ground near the rebuilt chimney stack at the far end of the slope. She looked at the boot prints pressed into the soft earth beside it, deep, deliberate impressions of someone who had stood there with purpose, and her expression shifted for just a moment. A small rearrangement that she did not explain. Then she was gone, moving quickly through the trees, a woman returning to the world of convention before it noticed she'd left. Elara stood at the edge of the creek with the bundle in her hands. Something in her that she had kept locked and frozen for the better part of 2 years shifted slightly. Not breaking, just moving. The way ice moves on a river in early spring before it breaks. A sound like rearranging. 4 days later, Merritt Callaway came. He came on foot, walking beside a mule-drawn cart loaded with Douglas fir, straight-grained, well-seasoned good wood by any measure. He had split and stacked it himself. He found Elara fitting capstones onto the first completed section of the flue, positioning each flat piece of sandstone with the patience of a watchmaker, pressing each joint to test the clay seal before moving to the next. Merritt Callaway was 52 years old and had built nearly every structure in Coldwater Ridge. The town hall, the church, the mill, 24 cabins that had stood through 15 Montana winters without losing a single roof beam. He was proud of this record, and he had earned the right to be. His hands were a craftsman's hands, scarred capable, the kind that understand wood the way a musician understands an instrument through years of intimate collaboration. He was also at his core a decent man, which was what made the next 20 minutes so difficult for both of them. He removed his hat when he addressed her. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who believes he is preventing a tragedy. Miss Voss, I've come to help. He gestured at the lumber. I have enough here for a tight lean-to south-facing against the rock wall, where you'll get whatever sun this slope offers. It won't be large, but it'll be dry, and I can frame a proper fireplace, stone and mortar, with a chimney that draws correctly. It will keep you and your mother alive through the winter. Elara looked at the wood. She looked at the cart. She looked at this good, confident man who had walked 2 miles uphill to deliver salvation in the form of Douglas fir and 30 years of professional certainty. She looked at the care in his face. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Callaway. It is generous. He heard the word coming before she said it. But the ground will not steal the heat. It will hold it. Merritt frowned. The ground is a thief, Miss Voss. I've known this land my whole life. A horizontal flue without a proper vertical rise will kill the draw. You'll fill that cave with smoke and suffocate in your sleep. He paused. I have to tell you something. He told her about a family in the next valley. The winter of 1879. A man, his wife, their daughter, 6 years old. They had tried to live through winter in a shallow cave, built a fire inside for warmth. The smoke had nowhere to go. By morning, all 3 were dead. He had been the one called to carry them out. His voice changed when he said it. Dropped into a register that had nothing to do with professional authority and everything to do with the specific weight of a child's body in a grown man's arms. The little one was the same age as my Lily. Elara listened to every word. She did not dismiss his experience or the grief that still lived in it. When he finished, she knelt beside the completed section of the flue, struck a match, and lit a handful of dry juniper needles in the stone firebox at the trench's head. She said nothing. She simply waited. The smoke did not billow into the cave. It did not rise toward the ceiling and gather in the choking bank that Merritt was bracing for. Instead, it was pulled downward, drawn into the stone-lined trench, with a deep, resonant sound like the intake of a long breath. It moved through the passage and disappeared into the earth, traveling its 40-foot journey beneath the floor toward the chimney stack at the far end. Both of them watched it. Merritt stared for a long time. "That's just the wind," he said, but his voice was different now, less certain. "It's the temperature differential creating a natural draw. 40 feet of horizontal passage gives that draw more pull than any vertical chimney you've built." She looked up at him. "The hot gases are moving through the stone. The stone is absorbing the heat. By the time the smoke reaches the chimney, it will have surrendered most of what it carried." He held her gaze. He was searching for doubt in it, for the performance of confidence rather than the real thing. He found neither. What he found was simply a 17-year-old girl who had done the mathematics and was not afraid of the answer. "That's poetry," he said finally. "Not physics. You are putting your mother's life at risk on a theory. It's engineering, my father's engineering." The silence between them was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, each certain that the ground beneath their own feet is solid. Merritt shook his head slowly with more sorrow than anger. "I'll leave the lumber," he said, "in case you change your mind." He put his hat back on. "I wish you well, Miss Voss." He turned and walked back down the slope toward the town, his silhouette steady and upright, a man returning to the world of plumb lines and right angles and the comfortable authority of doing things the way that has always worked. Ezra, who had watched from his position near the cave entrance, without a word, waited until Callaway was out of earshot. "He's not wrong to be afraid," Ezra said quietly. "He just doesn't know what your father knew." From inside the cave, Helena had heard everything. She came out now, her shawl tight, her face pale. She looked at the pile of lumber, then at her daughter. Alara saw it in her mother's eyes, the specific fear of a woman who has buried one person she loved and is watching the other walk close to a similar edge. Not anger, not disappointment. Fear marrow deep and entirely reasonable. "Perhaps take the wood," Helena said. "Build the lean-to, just in case." "I'll take the wood," Alara said, "but not for a lean-to. I'll use it to seal the cave mouth." Helena closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted in her expression. Not confidence, something quieter than that. The decision to trust that in certain circumstances is indistinguishable from the decision to pray. She nodded. Then she went back inside to mix more clay. 3 weeks into the construction, Nathan Hollis came to the Scarp in the dark. It was past midnight. The moon was 3/4, and the slope was washed in cold silver, every loose stone throwing its small shadow. Nathan came with a bottle of whiskey that was mostly already inside him. He came without a plan, driven by something he could not name and would not have recognized if someone had named it for him. It was not hatred, it was the anguish of irrelevance. Ara Voss did not need him, did not want him, did not, as best he could tell, think of him at all, which was somehow worse than contempt, because contempt at least required your existence to be registered. She moved through the world with a self-containment that said more clearly than any words that she had everything she required. And in the economy of Nathan Hollis's sense of self-worth, being unnecessary was the same as being erased. He stood over the chimney stack at the far end of the trench. It had taken Alara 2 full days to build it, 3 feet of carefully selected and precisely stacked stone, each joint sealed with clay, mixed to the exact consistency Conrad's journal specified. She had built it with the same patient attention she brought to every part of this project. It was in its own way beautiful. Functional beauty, the kind that comes from total alignment between purpose and form. Nathan put his boot against it. The first kick was tentative, testing. The second was harder. The third was something else, an act of pure destruction that sent stones scattering and clay cracking, and 2 days of careful work collapsing into a pile of rubble in approximately 4 seconds. He stood over it, breathing hard, the whiskey bottle loose in his hand. He waited for satisfaction. It didn't come. What came instead was worse than anything he'd anticipated. A sudden hollow absence where the satisfaction should have been a silence inside him that was much louder than what he'd just created outside. He sat down on the rock beside the wreckage. He stayed there for a long time, not moving, looking at what his boot had made of what her hands had built. At some point during that sitting, the sound reached him, faint, muffled by the cave wall, but unmistakable in the night's quiet. Helena's cough. It came in its familiar pattern, three short, sharp contractions, a pause, then the longer rattle of something working loose from somewhere deep. He had last heard that particular sequence when he was 9 years old, sitting outside his mother's bedroom door, because he was not allowed inside, listening to the same sound, moving through the same progression. He had been helpless then. He sat on the rock beside the ruined chimney stack in the silver Montana night and understood with the clarity that sometimes arrives in the lowest moments that he was helpless now too. Not because he lacked the strength to rebuild what he'd destroyed, but because the thing he was actually trying to destroy, the fact of his own irrelevance, was not made of stone and clay. When he finally stood and walked away, his boot prints were pressed deep into the soft ground beside the rubble. Elara found the destruction at dawn. She stood before it in the early gray light with her hands at her sides and said nothing. She looked at the boot prints. She looked at the broken whiskey bottle, the glass catching the first pale light. She looked at the specific pattern of the damage, the direction the stones had fallen, the angle of the impact that had broken the clay joints. She knew. She stood there for a long time. Her body trembled, and it was not from cold. It was from a fury so complete that it had passed through sound and come out the other side as silence. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of a pressure so great it has compressed itself beyond the range of audible expression. Helena appeared at the cave mouth. She saw the damage. She saw her daughter's face. She did not speak. After a while, Elara picked up the pickaxe and began clearing the rubble. 2 hours later, she walked down the slope to Coldwater Ridge and pushed open the door of Hollis General Store. The bell above the door announced her. Nathan was behind the counter sorting nails into bins with the practiced efficiency of a man on familiar ground. When he saw her, something moved across his face, a complex sequence of emotions that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and resolved into a careful blankness. He had prepared himself for accusation, for tears, for the public naming of what he had done. "I need wire and hinges," Elara said. "I'll pay with labor, one day in your stockroom." Nathan blinked. He had rehearsed responses to several possible versions of this conversation. This was not one of them. "I thought you didn't need anyone," he said, and the words came out wrong, defensive when he'd meant them to sound casual. "I don't need charity. I'm buying supplies." He looked at her for a moment. She returned the look without heat, without accusation, without any of the anger she was certainly entitled to carry in her eyes. There was simply nothing there that referenced what had happened on the hillside. No signal, no coded message, no meaningful pause. Just a transaction. Just commerce. She spent the following day in the stockroom. 8 hours organizing shelves, sorting inventory, moving crates with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. Nathan found reasons to work near the stockroom door. He watched her through the gap. She never looked at him with accusation. She never looked at him at all in the way that counted. And this, more than any confrontation, more than any naming of the thing he had done, was what undid him. Because it said something he could not argue with. She had seen what he'd done, had understood something of why he'd done it, and had decided that he was not worth the energy of her rage. That he was in the final accounting, a minor problem to be managed rather than an adversary to be faced. He had never felt smaller. She rebuilt the chimney stack in 2 days. This time she set the foundation stones in a trench below grade, packing the base with the heaviest rocks from the slope. Stones that would require more than a boot, more than a motivated act of petty destruction. She worked with a focused efficiency that was different from before. Before she had been building. Now she was also defending. The distinction lived in her jaw and the set of her shoulders in the extra hours she spent checking every joint. Ezra watched without comment. He understood the difference. The crisis came 12 days before Helena's deadline. The final 5 feet of the trench, the section connecting the main flue run to the base of the rebuilt chimney stack, had seemed straightforward until Elara's pickaxe broke through into something unexpected. Not rock, not clay, not the compacted gravel she'd been working through for the past hour. Water. Not a rush, not a flood, just a quiet, insistent upwelling from somewhere below, a seep rising through the disturbed gravel with the patience of something that has been waiting a long time for this particular opening. Within an hour, 2 inches of groundwater stood in the bottom of the trench. She stared at it. She understood immediately what it meant. Water pooled in the flue would absorb the heat from the passing gases and convert it to steam rather than conducting it into the surrounding stone. The thermal transfer, the entire mechanism on which her father's design depended, would fail. The 38 feet of flue she had already completed, every stone laid and sealed and tested, would become an elaborate channel to nowhere. A monument to a system that never worked. She sat in the trench with her legs in the cold water and felt for the first time the architecture of her determination begin to crack. She had accounted for rock. She had accounted for cold, for mockery, for the solitude of working without allies, for the physical limits of her own body, for the destroyed chimney stack and the 2 days of lost work. She had not accounted for this. The earth which she had trusted, which her father had trusted, had opened a vein of hidden water directly beneath the place where she needed it most. Ezra came and looked. He said nothing. He crouched at the edge of the trench and studied the seep, watching the way the water moved, where it entered, where it collected. Helena came and stood above her daughter. She looked at the water. She looked at Alara's face, still pale, not defeated, but very close to the edge of something. She did not speak. Alara opened the journal with hands that were not entirely steady. She turned pages without knowing exactly what she was looking for. She turned to the section she'd read a dozen times, then passed it to the pages she hadn't yet been able to decipher, the ones in the back, where the ink had been damaged by moisture at some point, where the letters had blurred and run together, and her attempts to read them had produced only fragments. She held the page toward the cave entrance, where the afternoon light came in at its lowest and most horizontal angle, raking across the paper's surface. In that raking light, the pressure of the pen on the paper cast its own faint shadow, the impression of letters that the water had blurred but not destroyed. She tilted the page, held it still, let her eyes adjust. Words emerged from the damage, slow like things rising from depth. Grade the floor at 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope. She read it twice. Then she looked at the chalk mark on the flat stone outside the cave entrance. The arrow, the number, 2 degrees. Ezra had known. He had stood on this slope before she arrived and had known what she would find here, not because he could predict the specific geology of every tunnel she would dig, but because Conrad had encountered the same problem in the mines, had solved it, had told Ezra about it. And Ezra had left a warning in chalk, and that warning had been waiting for the moment she needed it. Her father had faced this. Her father had solved this. She spent 2 days reopening every sealed section of the flue, pulling up capstones, lifting and repositioning, laid stones, cutting the grade adjustment into the floor of the trench, with the iron chisel working toward a consistent 2-degree downward slope, running from the firebox end to the chimney end. She cut a narrow drainage channel along one side to carry the seep water out and away from the main passage. She repacked every clay joint she disturbed. She did not stop to acknowledge what this cost in time and labor in the narrowing margin between now and the 15th of November. She simply worked. When she finished and relayed the final capstones, the water followed the grade. It found the drainage channel. It moved not fast, but with the steady reliability of something operating according to a law that does not make exceptions. The trench floor was dry. The system was intact. That evening, Alara sat alone outside the cave entrance on the bare rock of the Scarp, while the last light drained from the sky. The cold was settling in, a different cold than the daytime, heavier, more committed, the temperature that the earth itself reaches for when the sun stops arguing. She did not plan what happened next. She was simply too tired to prevent it. She put her face in her hands and she wept. It came without preamble, without the warning of a tightened throat or burning eyes. It simply arrived, a collapse as total as any she had experienced, the product not of a single cause, but of everything that had accumulated over weeks and years, and the specific 14 months since a shaft in a copper mine had closed over her father's head. She did not cry from sadness. She cried from a tiredness so profound that it had dissolved the boundary between her body and her will, and there was nothing left to hold anything back. "I'm so tired, Pa," she said. Barely a sound. More like something she was telling the rock beneath her than the sky above. She did not hear Helena come out of the cave. She only became aware of her mother when Helena sat down beside her on the cold rock, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that their shoulders touched. Helena said nothing. She did not offer comfort or platitude or cheerful instruction about the importance of carrying on. She simply sat, and after a moment she put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they stayed that way while the first stars appeared above the ridge. Then Helena said quietly, in the voice she used when she was going to say something that cost her something, "Your father used to cry, too, every night after his shift. He thought I didn't know. He would sit on the back step and put his face in his hands." She paused. "But every morning he went back into that mine. Elara said nothing. She did not need to. Then Helena said the thing she had been carrying for years, the thing that Elara had not known was waiting to be said. Conrad had known his lungs were failing. Not a suspicion knowledge, the careful, documented knowledge of a man who had studied his own decline with the same methodical attention he gave everything else. The mine dust, the years of it. He had felt the change long before it became visible, and he had gone to Doc Taft quietly without telling Helena, and he had asked his questions and received his answers and come home and said nothing. Because he had a plan. He had been coming to the Scarp for 2 years before the accident, not casually, systematically. He had surveyed the geology, mapped the cave's internal dimensions, studied the sandstone formation beneath the floor. He had understood what the slope could hold and how the cave breathed, and what the specific combination of rock type and orientation and internal geometry made possible. He had done the calculations, drawn the diagrams, filled the pages that Elara now carried. He had been building a home for his wife, a home where the air was clean and warm and the dust of the mines could not reach her. A home designed to keep her lungs safe after he was gone, because he had understood with the clear-eyed practicality of a man reading his own geological formation that he would be gone before he was finished. He wasn't building a house, Helena said. Her voice was very quiet. He was keeping a promise he made to himself, to keep me alive after he couldn't. She looked at her daughter. He never got to keep it. A long silence. But you kept it, Helena said. You are keeping it. Elara looked at the journal in her lap, the pages she knew almost by memory. Now the diagrams she had followed and measured and trusted, the handwriting that had become as familiar to her as the sound of his voice. She understood now what she was holding. Not a technical manual, not the notes of an engineer. A love letter, written in the only language Conrad Voss had ever been entirely fluent in, the language of problems solved and structures built and things made to last. She reached across and took her mother's hand. They sat there until the cold became insistent, and then they went back inside, and Elara fed the last of the evening wood into the firebox, and Helena lay down on her bedroll and was asleep within minutes. Her breathing slow and even, in the particular way it had become in the cave, better than it was in the cabin, better than it had been in months, as though even the unfinished system was already doing something. The 2nd of November, 13 days before the deadline, 30 feet of flue complete, 10 remaining, and the water problem solved. She would finish. She lay in the dark, and she was certain of it, in the way that certainty feels when it has been earned rather than assumed. Not the bright, uncomplicated certainty of someone who has never been tested, but the quieter, more durable certainty of someone who has looked at the worst and not looked away. 10 more feet, and then the stone would remember everything it had been given. The cave was sealed on the 2nd of November, 13 days before Helena's deadline. The front wall was built from the lumber Merritt Callaway had left behind, supplemented with weathered planks that Elara had hauled up the slope over 2 days of backbreaking trips. She framed a solid wall into the mouth of the cave, leaving space for a single stout door and one small window fitted with a pane of glass she had traded Helena's silver locket to acquire. Every gap between the planks was packed with moss and clay, pressed in with her fingers, and smoothed until the seal was as complete as she could make it. The first fire was built on the 4th of November, a small one, a handful of dry juniper branches in the stone firebox. Elara struck the match and held it to the kindling and watched the flames catch and grow. And then the sound that draw a deep resonant pull as the hot air was drawn down into the throat of the flue and sent on its long horizontal journey beneath the floor. The smoke did not enter the room, not a wisp. It vanished into the earth as though the mountain itself were inhaling. For 3 hours, nothing else happened. The fire burned cleanly, the air in the cave remained cold, and Elara sat with her back against the stone wall and fed wood into the firebox at measured intervals, and did not let herself think too hard about what it would mean if nothing changed. It was late that night when she felt it. She was lying on her bedroll, the fire banked to a bed of glowing coals, when something shifted. Not in the air and the floor. The deep, penetrating cold that had seemed to radiate from the stone itself had receded slightly. She rolled onto her stomach and pressed her palm flat against the cave floor a few feet from the firebox. Warmth. Faint. Almost imaginary. But real. She moved her hand along the path of the buried flue. The warmth strengthened, bleeding up through the stones below like heat from a living body. 40 feet of rock and earth, charged by the passage of hot gases, were beginning to release their stored energy. She lay there with her hand on the warm floor and felt a relief so profound it was almost indistinguishable from grief. It was the feeling of a person who has been holding their breath for 6 weeks and finally exhales. She looked at her mother. Helena was asleep. Her breathing was even steady clear. No cough. For the first time in months, no cough. The morning of the 11th of January arrived wearing the wrong season's face. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 43 degrees, which in January in Montana is not warmth, it is a statement. The kind of statement that the land makes before it changes its mind entirely. Children were playing in the streets of Coldwater Ridge without their coats. Men stood in doorways with their thumbs in their suspenders and talked about early thaws. Women opened windows that had been sealed since October, airing out the accumulated staleness of months of closed rooms. The sky was a deep, unmarked blue. The sun had actual weight to it. Alara walked out of the cave at midday and stood on the ledge above the valley. She felt it immediately. Not the warmth, the wrongness of the warmth. The way it arrived too easily, too completely, too generous, in the specific way that gifts are generous when they want something in return. She lifted her face to the northwest and breathed. There it was. Under the false gentleness of the Chinook wind, under the smell of snowmelt and pine resin, a faint metallic edge. The smell of pressure dropping. The smell of a sky that is reorganizing itself for something it hasn't shown you yet. Conrad had written about this in his Mind Safety Notes. When winter gives you an unexpected warm day, it is gathering momentum. Do not be fooled by what you are given. Prepare for what is being withheld. Alara went back inside. She moved through the cave with the systematic attention of someone running a checklist that exists only in her own mind. She checked every seal on the front wall. She checked the chimney draw. She checked the wood supply and cut and stacked additional timber until the supply extended to 4 weeks. She tested the door. She tested the window frame. She ran her hands along the base of the front wall where it met the cave floor, checking for gaps. Everything was ready. She did not know for what. She only knew that the earth was preparing something, and that preparation was the only response available to her. That night she lay awake in the dark and listened to a silence so complete it had its own weight. Outside, the wind had stopped entirely. The silence pressed against the cave's front wall with the specific quality of silence that precedes not peace but rupture. Helena slept beside her, breathing in the slow, even rhythm that the cave had given back to her over these weeks, the rhythm that Doc Taft had said might not be possible, that had returned breath by breath, as the warm, clean air did its patient work on the scarred tissue of her lungs. Alara stared at the stone ceiling and waited for the sound she could not yet hear. It came the following afternoon. At 1 o'clock on the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature in Coldwater Ridge was 43 degrees. Children were still outside. A man was painting the front of his hardware store without his jacket. At 1:15, the horizon to the northwest turned black. Not gray, not the slow building gray of an ordinary storm gathering itself over hours. Black. A wall of darkness that extended from the ground to the absolute top of the visible sky, advancing across the valley at a speed that did not match anything the people of Coldwater Ridge had a framework for. It moved the way a door moves when someone on the other side pushes it hard, fast, committed, and with the full weight of something enormous behind it. The wind arrived before the snow did. It came as a physical force, not a gust, not a sustained blow, but a single continuous impact that knocked a man off his ladder and tore the sign from the front of the feed store and sent it spinning into the street. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes. Then it kept dropping. The snow arrived not as individual flakes, but as a solid white mass, a blizzard so dense that visibility collapsed to nothing. Within seconds, a man standing on the main street of Coldwater Ridge could not see the building directly across from him. History would remember this as the school children's blizzard of 1888. The name came from the dozens of children across the northern plains who were caught outside when the storm arrived without warning. In the middle of what had felt like a spring afternoon, children who had walked to school that morning without winter coats because the morning had felt like a gift, and who now found themselves in conditions that experienced frontiersmen did not survive. In Merritt Callaway's home, the finest cabin in Coldwater Ridge, built with the best lumber, in the most skilled hands, in the deepest understanding of Montana winters, that 30 years of construction work could provide, the storm found the weaknesses that good carpentry cannot cure. The wind drove through the log walls, carrying a fine, penetrating dust of snow that settled on furniture and skin alike. The great stone fireplace, Merritt's masterwork, the centerpiece of the home he was most proud of, consumed logs at a rate that turned his carefully accumulated winter supply into a diminishing monument to inadequacy. He fed it 3 logs at a time. The flames roared and leaped. 10 feet from that roaring fire, the temperature was below freezing. Owen lay on the cot they had pulled closest to the hearth, wrapped in every blanket the house contained. He had been feverish since morning, a childhood illness that under ordinary circumstances would have been managed with broth and rest and 3 or 4 days of careful attention. But the cold had found the fever and amplified it into something dangerous. His breathing was shallow and rapid, a sound that made Willa's hands tremble every time she wrung out another cloth and pressed it to his forehead. Lily sat beside her brother, holding his hand with the solemn concentration of a 7-year-old who understands that something is wrong but has not yet been given the vocabulary to describe how wrong. Merritt stood at the woodpile in the corner of the room and did the calculation that he had been avoiding for the past 2 hours. At their current rate of burning, they had enough to last through the night, perhaps into tomorrow morning. After that, he would begin on the furniture. After the furniture, the floorboards. After the floorboards, there was nothing left to burn, and nothing left to burn meant something he was not willing to finish that sentence. He looked at his wife. Willa was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face in 32 years of marriage, the look of a woman who has arrived through the slow arithmetic of a deteriorating situation at a conclusion she cannot speak aloud. He had built this house. He had built the fireplace. He had spent 20 years perfecting a method of construction that was at this precise moment failing to keep his children alive. In the general store at the center of town, Nathan Hollis was feeding wooden display racks into the pot-bellied stove one at a time, watching the brief flares of heat they produced get swallowed by the cold within seconds. His father, Garrett Hollis, 61 years old, a man who had spent 4 decades building a store that smelled of tobacco and order, sat in the chair by the stove with a blanket over his shoulders and coughed. It was a deep, wet sound. It came from the same place in the chest that sounds come from when they have been living there for a while. Nathan had heard that sound before. He had last heard it when he was 9 years old. He stood in his father's store with a broken piece of display rack in his hand and felt something go very still inside him. The kind of stillness that arrives not as peace but as sudden clarifying terror. The stillness of a person who has just understood that a thing they have been afraid of for 20 years has arrived and is standing in the same room. He thought about the hill. He thought about the warmth he had felt through the soles of his boots that night standing over the buried flue. That deep, sourceless, patient warmth rising from the earth itself. He had felt it. He had known even then, even with the whiskey and the wounded pride he had known, that what she was building worked. He put the broken rack into the stove and looked at the window where the snow pressed against the glass in a solid moving mass. And for the first time in months, he looked toward the hill north of town with something other than contempt. In the cave on the Scarp, Ara sat at the small table she had built from scrap lumber and mended a tear in her dress by the light of a single candle. The journal lay open beside her, not for reference tonight, but for company. Helena sat across from her knitting with the wool Willa Callaway had brought in October, her needles moving in a rhythm as steady and reliable as a heartbeat. The fire in the firebox was a modest thing, a handful of juniper branches feeding a bed of coals, more suggestion than blaze. But the floor beneath their feet was warm. Not warm the way a room is warm when you're standing close to a fire, warm the way the earth is warm when it has been storing heat for long enough that the heat has become part of the stone itself, even constant, coming from everywhere at once. The storm outside was a sound, distant, muffled by tons of rock and earth reduced to a low sustained roar that had been present long enough to become atmospheric. Something you stopped registering the same way you stopped registering the sound of a river when you've lived beside one long enough. The candle flame did not waver. Helena looked up from her knitting. "It sounds angry out there." "Yes," Ara said. "Are you worried?" Ara set down her mending. She listened to the storm's muffled voice, felt the warm floor under her feet, looked at the solid wall of rock that enclosed them on 3 sides, and the well-sealed wooden wall that closed the 4th. She thought about the 40 feet of stone passage beneath them, fully charged now, with weeks of accumulated heat radiating it upward through the floor, with the slow, inexhaustible generosity of a thing that has been trusted with something and intends to keep faith with it. "No," she said, and she meant it completely. The blizzard raged for 3 days. On the morning of the 2nd day, Merritt Callaway called what passed for an emergency meeting in the town hall, which was by then as cold inside as out, the men standing rather than sitting because the benches had become instruments of hypothermia. He spoke about organizing a logging party to the southern forest. He could hear, even as the words left his mouth, the impossibility of what he was proposing. The snow was chest-deep on flat ground and still falling. The forest was 2 miles away. They would lose men in the attempt before they cut a single tree. From the bench in the far corner of the room, Ezra Holt stood up. The men nearest him stepped back slightly, as startled as if the bench itself had decided to speak. Ezra had not stood at a town meeting in years. He was not a man people thought of as present, exactly more as a feature of the landscape, like the mountain visible through the window, noted but not consulted. "There is one place in this valley that may still be warm," he said. The room went very quiet. Everyone knew where he meant. The months of Mockery had made the location specific and the contempt precise. Voss's Folly, the Kraut burrow, the hole in the hill where the strange girl and her sick mother were almost certainly already dead. Judge Crane spoke first. "They can't have survived. It's a cave." "The girl is alive," Ezra said. His voice carried the flat, unargued certainty of a man reporting a geological fact. "Conrad Voss knew how to live inside stone. His daughter knows it too. I have seen what she built." He looked around the room at the frozen, desperate faces of men who had spent months mocking a 17-year-old girl and were now being asked to go to her for salvation. "I'm going. Callaway, are you coming or not?" Merritt Callaway did not hesitate. He was already moving toward the door. The journey from town to the Scarp was the hardest 2 miles Merritt had walked in his life. The snow reached his chest in the open sections, and breaking a path through it required throwing his full body weight forward with each step, and then dragging himself through the channel he'd created. Ezra moved more slowly, but with the mechanical patience of a man who had spent 30 years doing hard things in dark places, who had learned to allocate effort rather than spend it to work within his body's limits rather than against them. Merritt fell the first time at the tree line. He went down face first and lay there for a moment with the cold pressing against him from every surface, and felt distantly, dangerously the seductive simplicity of not getting up, of letting the white have him, of being finished with the arithmetic of this situation and all its impossible calculations. Ezra's hand closed around the back of his collar. The old man hauled him upright with a strength that seemed to come not from his body, but from some reserve deeper than muscle, the reserve that keeps a man swinging a pickaxe at the end of a 12-hour shift, the reserve that has nothing to do with physical capacity and everything to do with what you have decided you are not willing to accept. "Not yet," Ezra said. They moved on. Then Merritt saw it, a shimmer in the cold air above a small stone column barely visible above the snow surface at the far end of the slope. Not smoke, not exactly. A wavering in the light above the chimney stack, the way heat makes summer air move over a hot road. Spent gases almost entirely stripped of their thermal content after 40 feet of underground passage rising in a barely visible thread from the earth. And behind the chimney stack at the top of the slope, the wooden wall of the cave, intact, solid, braced against 3 days of one of the worst blizzards in Montana's recorded history without so much as a warped board. And in the small window set into that wall, warm light, steady and golden, and completely indifferent to the chaos outside. Merritt reached the door. His hand inside its frozen glove barely responded when he tried to make a fist to knock. He managed it. 3 times. The door opened inward. The warmth came out to meet him before he could step inside. Not the sharp directional heat of a fireplace. Not the dry metallic blast of a stove. Something deeper and more even, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the floor and the walls and the air simultaneously, as though the entire structure were the source of it rather than any single point. It moved against his frozen face like something alive. Alara stood in the doorway wearing a simple dress and no shawl, her hands unhurried at her sides. The cave behind her was lit and warm and arranged with the quiet order of a place that has been lived in carefully. The table, the shelves, the bedrolls, the small firebox where a modest fire breathed its heat downward into the earth. Merritt stumbled across the threshold. He stood in the center of the cave and turned slowly, his mind working to reconcile what his senses were reporting with everything he knew about shelter and heat and the correct ways of keeping a human body alive through a Montana winter. He pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white and stiff. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the rough stone wall of the cave. It was warm. Not surface warm the way a stone warms briefly when you hold it in your hand. Deeply warm consistently. Warm in the way that living things are warm, as though the heat were coming from within the stone rather than applied to its surface. He held his hand there for a long time. In that single tactile moment in the space between his palm and the warm mountain rock, something gave way in Merritt Callaway. Not violently, not with the drama of a structure failing. Quietly, the way certainty gives way when confronted with evidence it cannot incorporate, not falling so much as rearranging the foundation, shifting to accommodate a fact that the original design had not accounted for. He had built containers, boxes that kept the weather out and let the heat escape and required constant exhausting fuel to maintain the gap between survival and the alternative. This girl, this child he had pitied and cautioned and tried to save with his Douglas fir and his 30 years of professional experience, had built something that worked with the earth rather than against it, something that understood the mountain instead of simply sitting on top of it. Ezra had already found his corner. The old man sat on the warm floor with his back against the stone wall and his eyes closed, and the expression on his weathered face was the expression of a person who has come home to a place they have never physically been before. Merritt turned to Alara. The words caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. He had spent weeks certain that she was wrong. He had told her so. He had left her with his lumber and his pity and the professional judgment that her plan would kill her mother, and he had walked away feeling that he had discharged his responsibility to the truth. "My boy is sick," he said. His voice had lost its professional register entirely. It was just a man's voice. "We have no more wood." Alara looked at him. She did not look at him the way a person looks at someone who has been proven wrong. She did not reach for the moment. She saw only what she had always seen when she looked at another person's extremity, something that required a response. "Bring your family here," she said. "There is room and it is warm." She loaded her small sled with wood from her own supply enough to build a fire in the Callaway cabin, for the journey enough to get Owen through the move without the cold finding the fever's opening. Merritt took the sled rope. He turned toward the door. Stopped. Did not turn around. He could not look at her while he said it, and she did not require him to. "In 1879, I carried a little girl out of a cave," he said. "She was 6 years old and she was already gone. I swore I'd never let it happen again. So when you started building, I told myself I was protecting you." A silence that had weight in it. But I was protecting myself. From being wrong about everything I'd built my life on. From having to admit that a 17-year-old girl understood something about the earth that I had missed in 52 years of working with it. His voice dropped further. "You were right. About all of it. I was too proud to see it until my boy was burning up and I had nothing left to burn." He went out into the storm. The Callaway family arrived that evening. Willa first pushing through the door with Owen in her arms and Lily pressed close against her side. The boy limp and flushed his breathing, the shallow, rapid sound that had been keeping Willa awake for 2 days. Lily looked around the cave with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a 7-year-old encountering something entirely new. "It's warm in here, Mama," she said, "like a bear." It was Helena who took Owen, not Alara Helena. The woman the town had written off as too sick to matter, too fragile to be of use, knelt beside the cot they arranged near the firebox and placed her hand on the boy's forehead with the quick, certain touch of someone who has done this before. Not as a doctor, as a woman who had spent years learning the specific vocabulary of fever and what it required. She heated water, she wrung cloths and laid them across the boy's chest. She sang something old in German, a melody that had no direct translation into English because it had never needed one. A song that existed in the register below language, where the body simply hears and responds. Owen stopped thrashing. His hand found the edge of the warm cloth and held it. Willa sat across from Helena and watched this woman whose language she didn't speak, whose country she'd never seen, hold her son back from the edge of something. At some point in the night, without planning it or deciding it, she reached across and took Helena's free hand. Helena did not stop singing. She held Willa's hand and smoothed the boy's hair and sang the old words. And neither woman needed to speak, because what was happening between them was already complete. 2 mothers, the universal grammar, the oldest possible conversation. More families came through the next day, guided by Merritt, who made the journey from town 3 times through the snow. By the second night, the cave held 14 people. It was crowded. It was uncomfortable in the specific ways that shared space is uncomfortable. But it was warm, and everyone in it was alive. On the third day, Nathan Hollis appeared. He came alone. No announcement. He stood in the doorway with the look of a man who has been through something interior, the kind of passage that changes the geography of a face. He was thinner than he had been. His eyes, which had always had a quality of watchful calculation, were simply tired now. The room noticed him. Several people in it knew what he had said about the cave in the months of its construction. Elara looked at him from across the crowded cave. She read his face the way her father had taught her to read stone, not the surface but the stresses beneath it. She saw a 19-year-old boy who had organized his entire sense of worth around being needed and had constructed that need through a kind of subtle coercion. She saw the shape that his mother's death had left in him. She saw the broken chimney stack rebuilt and buried, and she chose in that moment to leave it there. She stepped to the side and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Is your father all right?" Nathan's mouth opened, closed. He stepped across the threshold, and when his feet met the warm floor, something in his legs gave way. He sat down hard against the wall, and his shoulders shook. The tears came without sound, the way they come from people who have spent so long performing strength that they have forgotten the mechanics of release. Willa Callaway, watching from across the cave, looked down at the soles of Nathan's boots. She studied them for a moment, the tread, the wear pattern, the dried mud pressed into specific angles. Then she looked at Elara. Elara met her gaze and gave the smallest possible movement of her head. Willa understood. She looked away. Some debts are not paid in confession. Some are paid in the slow, wordless labor of becoming different from what you were. When Nathan could speak, Elara said, "Tomorrow morning go back for your father. I'll give you wood for the trip." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you are cold," she said. And that was all. Nathan left before first light, pulling a sled loaded with firewood through snow that reached his chest. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that goes through clothing as though it isn't there, and begins its work on the body directly. He fell 3 times in the first quarter mile. The third time he lay in the snow for a moment and felt the cold pressing against him from every direction. He got up. He reached the store. He loaded his father onto the sled, wrapped the old man in every blanket they had, and pulled him back up the hill to the cave. 4 hours. By the time he arrived, his hands were bleeding inside his gloves, and he was past the point of feeling them. It was the first honest thing Nathan Hollis had ever done. Not the first useful thing, not the first visible thing, but the first thing he had done entirely for its own sake, with no calculation of return, no audience, no story he planned to tell about it afterward. No one had asked him to. That evening, when the cave was quieter, Owen's fever had broken at dawn. Lily had fallen asleep with her head on Willa's lap. The older men had found positions against the walls and were dozing. Ezra Holt reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He removed a stone. Red sandstone veined with dark shale small enough to close a fist around. It had been carried long enough that the geological surface had been replaced by something else. The specific smoothness of an object that has been held and turned and held again, worn by the friction of years of human attention, into a texture that was no longer quite natural and not yet quite artificial. Something in between, which is where the most important things usually live. He set it on the table in front of Elara. "Conrad gave that to me the week before the collapse," he said. His voice was low, and the cave, despite its 14 inhabitants, seemed to go quieter around it. "I've told you that. What I haven't told you is why I waited so long." He looked at the stone rather than at her. "I knew about the Scarp for years. Conrad showed me everything, the geology, the survey, the plans. He trusted me with all of it. After the collapse, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that his family would find their own way." A pause that carried the weight of 4 years in it. "That was a lie. I was afraid. Afraid of caring about something again after he was gone. Afraid of watching something fail that he had loved. Afraid of being the one who got it wrong after he trusted me to carry it forward." He looked at her now directly. "Your father would have come to you years before you needed it. He would have made sure you had everything, every diagram, every measurement, every piece of knowledge he'd spent years gathering. I waited until the world forced your hand and then left you a chalk mark on a rock and called it help." He stopped. "That's not a debt paid. That's a failure dressed up as one." The cave was quiet around them. Elara looked at the stone. She reached out and picked it up. Felt the warmth it carried from years in Ezra's pocket, the specific warmth of a stone that has been trusted to a person and kept. She turned it in her hand. The sandstone and the shale, the two materials her father had cataloged as ideal for thermal masonry, the two materials that formed the floor of the cave beneath their feet, radiating their accumulated heat upward into the room where 14 people were alive because of what he had understood and she had built. She held the stone for a long time. "He trusted you with it," she finally said. "You brought it here. You came when it mattered." She set the stone on the table between them. Not absolution, not the erasure of the years he had waited. Just the truth stated plainly, with the understanding that the truth was enough, that it was in fact the only currency that had ever meant anything in this cave. Ezra looked at the stone for a long time. Then he looked at the cave around him, at the warm floor, at the sealed wall, at the small firebox, where the coals breathed their heat downward into the 40 feet of stone passage that surrendered it to the earth and received it back transformed. At Helena asleep against the wall with Owen's head on her shoulder, the boy's color returned, his breathing easy. At Merritt Callaway asleep in the corner, with his craftsman's hands open in his lap, all the authority drained out of them, just a man's hands resting. Conrad, Ezra murmured the name he had spoken 10,000 times in the dark of the mine, calling across a shaft, checking a position, sharing the shorthand of men who spend their days in each other's company underground. He was speaking to someone who was not in the room and was in the way that matters most everywhere in it. You would have loved this. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 15th. The world it left behind was remade 10 feet of snow, sculpted by 3 days of wind into shapes that bore no relationship to the landscape, beneath the temperature at 20 below zero. The sky, a hard, clear, polished blue that offered beauty without comfort. In Coldwater Ridge, the accounting of loss was becoming visible. 2 dead, most of the livestock gone. Every wood supply in the town exhausted. The structures that had seemed adequate before the storm revealed as the insufficient containers they had always been. Doc Taft came to the cave on a morning in late January, after the roads had been broken enough to walk them without dying. He ducked through the low doorway, straightened up inside, and stood very still for 2 full minutes without speaking. He touched the wall. He crouched and placed his palm on the floor, then moved it to a spot further from the firebox, then further still, mapping the heat gradient with the methodical attention of a man who does not trust impressions, only data. Then he opened his bag and examined Helena. He listened to her lungs with his stethoscope, had her breathe deep, had her cough measured the quality of what came out against what he had measured in October. When he finished, he folded his instrument and looked at Alara. "Her lungs are healing," he said. "The tissue is still scarred, that damage doesn't reverse entirely, but the progression has stopped. More than stopped. The air in here is warm, dry, and cleaner than anything else in this valley." He paused. "Better than any home in Coldwater Ridge." He put on his hat. "Your father came to me once asking whether a person could live underground without respiratory damage. I told him the theory was sound, but that I had never seen it proven." He paused at the door with his hand on the frame. "I have seen it now. Your father would have been proud, Miss Voss." He left without another word. He was not a man who wasted them. Judge Crane came to the Scarp 3 days after the storm broke, on foot, his hat in his hand. He did not stay long. He set a document on the table, nodded to Alara and Helena, with something in his face that was not quite an apology, and was the closest he would ever come to one, and left. The document was a deed. 10 additional acres surrounding the Scarp, granted free and clear. In the margin, in Crane's own handwriting, with the gratitude of the board. Alara accepted it without ceremony, without debt, without the performance of gratitude that would have been a kind of diminishment. She folded it and placed it with Conrad's journal in the red sandstone stone, the 3 things she kept together because they were the 3 things that meant the same thing. The summer of 1888 rebuilt Coldwater Ridge. Not the way it had been before. The arrogance was gone. The comfortable certainty that the old ways were sufficient had been burned to ash, along with the furniture and the fence posts, and the accumulated confidence of men who had not been tested at the right extreme. What emerged in its place was something more honest and more durable. Under Alara's guidance and Merritt Callaway's hands, the town adopted a new architecture. Homes were set into hillsides rather than on top of them, embracing the stable temperature of the earth. Massive stone hearths connected to long horizontal flues that ran beneath earthen floors, and sleeping platforms surrendering their heat to the ground before releasing spent air through distant chimney stacks. The wooden framing was Callaway's true strong, built to last. The thermal engineering was Alara's precise, efficient, designed around the principle that the earth is not an obstacle to warmth, but its most patient custodian. One evening that summer, working late by lamplight, Merritt and Alara sat together at her table with a sheet of paper between them. It was not a conversation that had been scheduled or planned. It simply began the way the best collaborations begin, out of proximity and shared purpose, and the gradual erosion of the wall between what one person knows and what another needs. Merritt drew first. A wooden frame properly jointed, the kind he could build in his sleep, strong, precise, designed to last a Montana winter with timber to spare. Then he paused, pencil hovering, and looked at her. Alara leaned forward and added the flue path, the long horizontal run beneath the floor, the grade adjustment, the distant chimney position. She adjusted the angle to account for the specific slope of the building site he'd sketched. Merritt studied the addition. He picked up the pencil and modified the foundation to accommodate the underground passage, reinforcing the points where the two systems met. Alara nodded. He nodded. It was not her invention or his. It was theirs, built from the collision of two different understandings of the same problem, each incomplete without the other. They called it the Voss Hearth. The name moved through the territory the way useful things move, not with the speed of sensation, but with the persistence of something that works. Travelers stopped in Coldwater Ridge and marveled at the warm, efficient homes. They asked questions, were directed to Alara, and left with drawings and measurements, and the specific understanding that this was not a trick or a novelty, but a return to something older than any of the methods it replaced. Ezra Holt died in the autumn of 1891 on a Tuesday afternoon in September, sitting in his corner of the cave with a cup of tea still warm in his hands. Helena found him. She said he looked peaceful, which was true, and like he was sleeping, which was also true. Alara buried him on the hillside above the cave beside a large piece of red sandstone that she set into the earth as a marker. She did not carve his name into it. The stone was enough. He had spent 4 years sitting on a warm floor with a cup of tea and the quiet satisfaction of a man who has finally paid what he owed in the only currency that could actually settle the debt. The stone would say what needed to be said to anyone who knew how to read it, which was the only audience that had ever mattered to either of them. Helena lived to 78. Her lungs healed so gradually and so completely that the healing itself became a kind of argument, not the dramatic argument of a single event, but the patient, cumulative argument of a body given what it needed for long enough to remember how to work. She outlived every prediction that Doc Taft had ever made about her, which she regarded with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had always found medical prognosis somewhat presumptuous. She lived to see her daughter become the person that Coldwater Ridge turned to when it needed to understand something difficult. Not a politician, not an official of any kind, something older than either. A person who had proved through the specific combination of suffering and craft and the willingness to trust what her father had left her, that she understood something fundamental about how to live in a hard place without being broken by it. She died in the cave in her bed with the stone floor warm beneath her and her daughter's hand in hers. Her last words were in German, something from the old lullaby, the one without a clear beginning or end, the one that simply exists the way water exists. Merritt Callaway built different things for the rest of his life. Not different in material, still wood, still the craft he had spent 30 years perfecting, but different in orientation. Every structure he built after the winter of 1888 incorporated the underground flue, the Earth's thermal mass, the understanding that warmth is not something you generate against the cold, but something you cultivate within it. He never built another conventional fireplace. He told people when they asked that he had been corrected by someone who knew more than he did, which was the most honest thing a craftsman can say and the rarest. Nathan Hollis ran this general store quietly and well for the rest of his life. Every spring, unmarked crates appeared at the cave entrance, wire hinges, good mortar, whatever the season's work required. No invoice, no note, no acknowledgement expected or offered. Alara used the materials without comment. It was a conversation conducted entirely in the language of actions, which was the only language Nathan had ever been fully fluent in, and it said everything that needed saying between two people who understood each other well enough not to need words. Years after, a traveler passing through Coldwater Ridge stopped at the general store for supplies. The man behind the counter was lean and watchful, with the steady eyes of someone who has learned at considerable cost the difference between being needed and being useful. He organized his shelves with a care that bordered on devotion. The traveler asked about the unusual homes he'd seen on his way into town, The ones set into the hillsides, the chimney stacks rising from the ground at distances that seemed wrong, the floors that were warm even in rooms where no fire had been lit for hours. Nathan directed him to the town records where the history of the method was documented. In the records, the traveler found a journal. Leather-bound, its pages filled with precise angular handwriting and diagrams drawn by a man who understood the earth the way most people never learn to understand anything completely patiently from the inside out. The journal of Conrad Voss miner, who had spent 11 years reading the mountain and the better part of 4 years designing a home for the woman he loved inside it, and who had died before he could build what he had designed, trusting that someone who came after him would know how to use what he had left. On the final page beneath the last diagram in Conrad's neat and unhurried hand was a single sentence, not addressed to anyone, not explained or prefaced or followed by anything else. Just set down in ink by a man who understood that the most important things he would ever say might not be heard until long after he was gone, and who wrote them down anyway, with the faith of a man who trusts the stone to hold what he cannot carry himself. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain does not fight the cold. It absorbs the sun and remembers its warmth. Be the mountain. The traveler closed the journal. He sat for a moment in the warm building, feeling the heat that rose through the stone floor, gentle, consistent, sourceless, in the way that the best gifts are sourceless, given so cleanly that the giving itself has become invisible. He thought about the kind of man who could write that sentence, and then about the kind of person who could read it and build what needed to be built from it, and then about everything that had to happen between the writing and the building. The grief, the doubt, the frozen nights, the water in the trench, the chimney stack rebuilt twice the 6 weeks of labor that had no guarantee at the end of it. He thought about what it takes to trust a voice that can no longer speak. Then he stood and walked outside into the cold Montana air. On the hillside to the north, above the rooftops of a town that had survived the worst winter in its memory and built something better from the wreckage of it, a thin thread of warmth rose from a small stone column barely visible against the clear sky. And in the window set into a door in the rock, a light burned warm and steady, and entirely without drama. The light of a place that has been inhabited with care for long enough that the care itself has become structural. The light of a place that has been loved into permanence. Someone was home, the mountain remembered.